I'm Michael Beloff, Magdalen and Trinity, and I was president in Michaelmas term 1962. I came to Oxford, to be candid, in order to become president of the union. I'd been offered a place at Cambridge, King's College, Cambridge, when I was 16, but I realised that the Cambridge Union was smaller, more modern, less distinguished than the Oxford Union. So I said to my parents, even though they were Oxford-based, I want to come back and I want to become president of the union. The election process was very different from what it is now. In those days, the results of the elections were really determined about the forensic performance of the candidates, and in particular for the presidency. I was favourite going into the first presidential election, and I was defeated by John McDonnell, a good friend of mine who also became a QC and then a KC. The reason, he also got into his election as the favourite, and he had lost to Hugh Stevenson, who became a very distinguished journalist. I went in as the favourite, and I had a problem about the motion. John McDonnell was a Catholic. I had been very active in causes like homosexual law reform and abortion law reform, all of which were antithetical to Catholic values. So I put forward the proposition that we debated the Catholic Church. My late father, who was a friend of Lord Longford, tried to persuade me, with Lord Longford's approval, not to debate religion, and that would have been a very wise move had I accepted it. So we debated, and John McDonnell made an absolutely marvellous speech, of which I remember most. He had the line, "I could say, to hell with the Pope." And he rightly won that particular election. Now, luckily, I had another go the next term against somewhat less formidable opponents. In those days, the Oxford Union actually was very politically engaged. The two major parties had splits within themselves. The Labour Party had the Gaitskellite tradition against the far left tradition, which was embodied really in the campaign for nuclear disarmament. The Conservatives had here a blue ribbon group, which was the equivalent of the Bow group, which Geoffrey Howe had founded in Cambridge, and then the traditional AUCA. So you had within the parties, there were these splits, and there were splits between the parties. And many of the debates were actually political debates, not just the usual confidence motion, but debates on other subjects of political interest. I remember when I became president, Simon Jenkins, who afterwards became editor of the Times, etc., was an editor of Charl at that stage, and he actually commented reasonably favourably on my term card by pointing out that I had actually moved into cultural issues as well as purely political issues, and he thought this was an interesting development, but one could be contrasted with the more purely political debates before. Of course, the debate which was the most memorable of my time was when I was president and the motion for the admission of women to full membership was debated, and that really did arouse very strong emotions. And as you know from matter of record, we lost first time, and then I, as ex-president, the next term, moved the motion for admission of women and succeeded. But the opposition on the first occasion was really very vocal and did, for some reason, touched kind of feelings that it's very difficult to understand now. You look back and say, come on, university, women in the university already, how can it be they were objecting to coming to the Oxford Union? But there we were. At that stage, it did arouse very strong emotions. Having failed, and I was just looking back, there was actually a Charl headline, which the second thing said, Beloff upset. Well, I was very pleased to know that my emotions were justified getting into it, but I was actually very angry. I mean, I thought that, the time had certainly come. And interestingly, that was an inherited characteristic because my father, in the 1930s, when he was an officer, had actually supported the admission of women. So it took another, 30 years or so, just under, to come in. But we decided immediately that I would move the motion the next term, and on the second round occasion, we did indeed succeed. And of course, that launched me in a sort of career of feminism, ending up persuading the Garrick they could no longer sustain it as an all-male membership. I had the pleasure of doing the Oxford Union debating tour of the United States just after I became president. I went with Jonathan Aitken. It was an extraordinary formative experience. We did, I think, 39 debates from starting with in Montreal and McGill, which I know is not in the United States, going all the way down to the Deep South in Alabama State University. We experienced a whole range of political views there. I mean, I think America, we thought, were really fairly conservative. It was the start of the civil rights movement. And when Jonathan and I had to go and debate in Alabama, we had not a crisis of conscience. We said, we're going to have to do something about this, because we wouldn't have chosen to go to what was then a segregated university, but it was the English Student Union that had organised it, and we couldn't really well pull out. So the compromise that we reached was that we debated, but we started by saying that it had to be accepted that neither of us approved of segregation and so on. But we were treated with remarkable courtesy after that. The South is notorious for its courtesy. But I remember we did other things. We debated at a prison, and I remember the people who the prisoners were debating against us saying, well, of course, you'll be very lucky to get out of this. And I said, well, not as lucky as you would be. But I seem to remember. But we had a fantastic time, very tiring, hedge hopping in these tiny little planes, two-seater planes, very little sleep, not much opportunity to do anything but try to sleep occasionally and to debate. But we learned such a lot out of that. I mean, I cannot tell you. As an education experience, it was major. It is quite interesting that the present Prime Minister, who did a graduate degree, as you know, at Oxford, said, I think it was a word he actually invented, though I never heard anyone else use it, and the importance of oracy in our educational system, that people learn to express themselves by speech and not just in writing. And he said that is something that is missing, and he wanted to encourage it. And I think the Oxford Union, obviously, is a very great example of where people do develop and polish their oratorical skills. And therefore, it's got a value not just about free speech, but about speech itself.